Imagine waking up every morning to see a massive truck blocking your own driveway, leaving you helpless in your own home. That's exactly what happened to me when the Karen sisters, two entitled women from down the street, decided that my driveway was their personal parking lot. At first I thought it was an honest mistake. Maybe they had visitors, maybe they didn't realize. But no, day after day, they deliberately left their truck there, smirking whenever I confronted them. I tried asking nicely, I begged, I explained, I even offered them alternatives. But they laughed in my face. "It's just a driveway, don't be so dramatic," one of them said. The other added, "Call whoever you want. No one will tow us." They were daring me, testing how far they could push me. I started losing hours of my life, waiting for them to move the truck before I could leave for work. One day I even missed an important meeting because they had blocked me in for hours. The more I pleaded, the more they mocked me. They believed they were untouchable, above the rules, and that I would never fight back. But entitlement always comes with consequences. What they didn't realize was that I had been documenting everything. Photos, videos, timestamps, even complaints filed with the city. When the day finally came, I didn't just call a tow truck, I called for justice. Their prized truck, the symbol of their arrogance, was taken away legally. And the best part, it was auctioned off for just $87. From laughter to tears, from power to humiliation, the Karen sisters learned that messing with the wrong person can cost them everything. This is the story of how I turned their arrogance into their downfall. It started off as just another ordinary week, the kind of week where nothing unusual happens, where your daily routine flows exactly as expected. I had no reason to believe that anything in my quiet suburban neighborhood was about to change. My house sat on a peaceful street, lined with modest homes, trimmed lawns, and neighbors who generally kept to themselves. Life there wasn't exciting, but it was stable, and stability was exactly what I liked. But stability doesn't last long when the Karen sisters are involved. The first time I noticed the truck, it didn't strike me as much more than a small inconvenience. It was early on a Monday morning, and I had been running late for work already. As I opened my front door with a travel mug of coffee in hand, I froze in disbelief. A massive red pickup truck was parked across my driveway, its bulky frame completely blocking my car in. For a moment, I just stood there blinking at it, thinking maybe I was mistaken. Maybe it belonged to a guest of one of my neighbors. Surely this wasn't intentional. I knocked on a few doors, asking politely if anyone knew whose truck it was. That's when I learned it belonged to two sisters who lived just a few houses down. People in the neighborhood had warned me about them before. They weren't particularly friendly, and they had a reputation for being difficult. Some called them entitled, others just avoided them altogether. But I had never personally had a reason to deal with them until that morning. I walked down the street and knocked on their door. After a few moments, one of the sisters, tall, blonde, and already scowling, opened it just a crack. I introduced myself politely and explained the situation. To my surprise, she rolled her eyes. "Oh, that. Yeah, we didn't have space in front of our place. Just move your car around it. It's not that big of a deal." Her tone was sharp, dismissive, as though I was the one inconveniencing her by asking her to move her truck. I was taken aback, but I kept calm. I explained that I couldn't move my car because it was blocked entirely. With a sigh of irritation, she slammed the door shut without a word. A few minutes later, she stormed out in slippers, shuffled into the truck, and pulled it forward just enough so I could barely squeeze my car out. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't apologize. She just sped off. At the time, I brushed it off. Maybe she was having a bad morning. Maybe it was a one-time mistake. I told myself not to overthink it, but I had no idea this was only the beginning of weeks of torment. The very next day it happened again. This time it wasn't morning, it was evening. I came home from work, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed, only to find the same truck planted right across my driveway once more. I was frustrated but still tried to handle it with patience. I knocked again. This time the other sister answered. She was shorter, heavier, with her hair tied up in a messy bun. She looked me up and down like she was already bored with me. I asked kindly if she could move the truck. Her response, a smirk. "We'll move it when we feel like it. It's just a driveway. Relax." Her words stung, not just because of their rudeness but because of the smugness dripping from every syllable. Still, I didn't want to escalate things with neighbors so early on. I sighed, muttered thanks, and waited nearly 20 minutes before they finally strolled outside, laughing loudly as though the entire situation was some inside joke between them. They moved the truck slowly, deliberately, while keeping their eyes on me the whole time. That was the moment I realized it wasn't an accident. They were doing it on purpose. Over the next several days, the situation spiraled into something worse than I could have imagined. Almost every morning or every other evening, their truck would appear in my driveway like an unwanted shadow. It became so predictable that I started waking up early just to check if I would be trapped again. Sometimes they parked there for just an hour or two. Other times they left it overnight. Each time, I had to either knock and ask or sit around waiting, completely powerless at work. I began arriving late. My boss raised an eyebrow one morning after my third late arrival in a single week. I tried explaining. But even as the words came out of my mouth, I knew how ridiculous they sounded. Who gets blocked in by the same truck every day? Who lets it keep happening? It sounded like something out of a sitcom. Except for me, it wasn't funny. The worst part wasn't even the inconvenience. It was their attitude. The more I asked them to stop, the more they seemed to enjoy doing it. Once, when I knocked, the first sister leaned against the doorframe and smirked. "Maybe you should find another place to park your car. Driveways aren't that important." The other chimed in from behind her, laughing. "Yeah, call the cops if you want. We'll be moved by the time they get here." That was when it hit me. They thought they were untouchable. They believed that because it was just parking, no one would ever take it seriously. They thought I would give up eventually, maybe even accept it as my new normal, but I couldn't. I wasn't just dealing with blocked cars anymore. I was dealing with a blatant lack of respect. It wasn't about a driveway, it was about being treated like I didn't matter. Like my time and my property were worthless compared to their convenience. Neighbors started noticing too. Some whispered to me in passing, saying they'd seen the sisters pull their truck into my driveway laughing. Others admitted the sisters had done similar things to them before, though not as consistently. Everyone seemed to shrug it off, saying it was easier not to pick a fight with them. But I knew this couldn't go on. Something had to change, so, while the Karen sisters believed they were winning, I quietly began preparing. I kept my cool on the outside, smiling politely every time I had to knock on their door. But inside, I was furious and determined. With every photo I snapped, with every timestamp I recorded, I was building something stronger than my frustration. I was building a case. What they didn't know was that the very behavior they mocked me for, the patience, the waiting, the chill attitude, was the very thing that would one day destroy them. Because I wasn't just waiting for them to move their truck, I was waiting for the right moment to move against them. And when that moment finally came, they would regret ever thinking my driveway was theirs to take. The second chapter of this ordeal began with me realizing that the Karen sisters weren't just being careless, they were actively enjoying the power they had over me. At first, I had convinced myself that their behavior might be some strange accident, a misunderstanding that could be resolved with patience. But after the second week, the truth became impossible to deny. Their parking in my driveway wasn't a mistake. It was a game to them, and I was their chosen target. Each day brought a new act of defiance. One morning I opened my curtains to see the sisters laughing loudly in their driveway as they deliberately steered their truck backward into mine, parking at an angle so sharp that I couldn't have moved my car even if I tried. I could hear their voices through my closed window, mocking, giggling, daring me to come out and confront them. When I finally did, they pretended to act clueless. "Oh, is this bothering you?" one said with exaggerated innocence. The other added, "We didn't even realize. We were just trying to find some space." Their sarcasm was like poison, and I could feel my patience snapping thread by thread. I tried calling the non-emergency police line once, but the dispatcher's voice was tired and uninterested. "If they move before we arrive, there's not much we can do," she explained, "unless it's consistent and you have evidence." Our hands are tied. That conversation stuck in my head. Evidence, that was the key. If I wanted justice, I couldn't rely on the hope that the police might catch them in the act. I would have to gather proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof. So that's exactly what I started doing. The very next day, instead of letting my frustration boil over, I picked up my phone and began taking photos. The first picture was timestamped 6:47 a.m., showing their truck blocking my silver sedan in the driveway. The second was at 7:15, still unmoved. By 7:45, I finally knocked on their door. And when they came out rolling their eyes, I snapped a discreet video of them climbing into the truck. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just stood silently as my camera recorded every smug glance they gave me. First, I worried they might notice what I was doing, but to my surprise, they didn't care. In fact, they seemed to think it was hilarious. "What? You making a movie?" One laughed. The other added, "You think anyone's gonna care about your little driveway diary?" I said nothing. I simply kept recording. Over the next 2 weeks, I built up an entire gallery of photos and videos, each one carefully labeled with the date and time. Sometimes they blocked me for 15 minutes, other times for over an hour. Once, they left the truck there overnight, forcing me to cancel dinner plans with a friend because I literally couldn't get out. That night I paced the house, fury boiling in my chest. I had never felt so trapped in my own home. But instead of exploding, I took another set of photos and filed another note in my growing evidence folder. The sisters, however, were escalating in their own way. They no longer even tried to pretend they were innocent. One evening, after I knocked for the third time in a single week, the taller sister leaned against the hood of the truck with her arms crossed. "You know, maybe you should thank us," she sneered. "We're making your boring little life interesting." The other cackled behind her, adding, "Yeah, you should pay us rent for using our truck as decoration." Their cruelty wasn't just petty, it was deliberate. Humiliation. And yet, I didn't take the bait. I smiled thinly, walked back inside, and wrote everything down in my notebook. Every insult, every smirk, every mocking word. The more they underestimated me, the stronger my resolve became. Neighbors began noticing too. Mrs. Carter, an older woman from across the street, approached me one afternoon as I was watering my plants. She glanced nervously toward the sisters' house and whispered, "I've seen what they've been doing. You should know, they've pulled the same stunts on others before. You're not the first, but you might be the only one stubborn enough to fight back." She offered to write a statement if needed, and I thanked her sincerely. One by one, other neighbors quietly admitted similar experiences, being cut off, disrespected, blocked in. It seemed the Karen sisters had made a habit of bullying the entire street. Armed with my growing pile of evidence and silent support from neighbors, I began researching local ordinances. To my satisfaction, I discovered that blocking a residential driveway was not only a civil nuisance but a towable offense in my city. The law was clear. If a vehicle was obstructing access to private property, the property owner had the right to call for removal, provided proper documentation was supplied. For weeks, the sisters had thought they were untouchable, but with each new screenshot, each recorded clip, I was one step closer to proving them wrong. Still, I knew timing mattered. If I called for a tow too soon, they would wriggle out of it. They'd simply claim it was temporary, that they had been about to leave. No, I needed them trapped by their own arrogance. I needed them so confident in their invincibility that they didn't even bother pretending anymore. That moment would come, I told myself. I just had to wait. Of course, waiting wasn't easy. My mornings turned into anxious rituals. Open the curtains, check the driveway, document the truck if it was there. Some days I felt exhausted, worn down by the constant inconvenience. I longed for my old life of quiet stability. But then I'd remember their mocking faces, their laughter at my expense, and my weariness turned back into determination. The sisters had no idea what I was building. To them, I was just the boring neighbor who complained too much, the guy who wouldn't chill out. They didn't see the fire burning beneath my calm exterior. They didn't notice the quiet satisfaction in my eyes as my folder of evidence grew thicker each day. By the end of that month, I had over 60 photographs, a dozen details, and several written statements from neighbors. My case was airtight, but I didn't strike yet. No, I wanted the perfect setup. I wanted their downfall to be so complete, so humiliating, that they would never dare treat anyone else this way again. And so, while the Karen sisters laughed and gloated, I waited patiently in the shadows of my own front porch. My time was coming. Their arrogance had planted the seed, and soon they would reap the harvest of consequences. By the time the third month rolled around, I had reached a strange kind of calm. The Karen sisters still parked their massive red truck across my driveway as if it were their personal property. But instead of fuming, I treated it like a ritual. Every time I saw their truck sitting smugly in front of my house, I pulled out my phone, snapped a photo, and filed it neatly into my growing evidence folder. Each picture was another brick in the wall I was building against them. And while they thought I was helpless, in truth I was patient. The sisters grew bolder with every passing week. They no longer even bothered to pretend they might move quickly. Sometimes, I'd knock on their door, and they wouldn't answer at all. Other times, they'd open it just to smirk at me and then slam it shut again. They wanted me to break, to snap and scream at them so they could play the victim. But I never gave them that satisfaction. Instead, I smiled thinly, turned on my heel, and went back to my porch. And every time I updated my notebook with the date, the time, and what they had said. It wasn't just me who noticed the escalation. My neighbors were beginning to whisper louder now. Mrs. Carter, the sweet old lady across the street, told me she had seen the sisters purposely block me in while laughing at my reaction from their window. Another neighbor, Mr. Lopez, admitted he once saw them circling around the block, waiting for me to pull into my driveway just so they could swing in behind me and trap me. They weren't just careless anymore, they were playing a cruel game. That was the final straw. I had more than enough evidence to prove a consistent pattern of harassment. So, one evening after their truck had once again sat across my driveway for hours, I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and submitted everything I had to the city's parking enforcement office. Photos, videos, witness statements, my detailed log that stretched back nearly 2 months. I pressed send with a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment things would change. The very next day I got a call back from a calm but firm officer. "We've reviewed your evidence," he said. "It's thorough, and you've documented this well. If it happens again, you are authorized to call us directly. We'll dispatch a tow immediately." I almost couldn't believe it. After months of humiliation, months of being treated like my property didn't matter, I finally had the backing of the law. And, wouldn't you know it, the sisters practically walked right into the trap the very next morning. It was a Tuesday, the kind of morning where the air feels heavy with humidity and the street is still quiet. I opened my curtains at 6:45 a.m. and there it was, the big red truck blocking me in once again. I almost laughed. It felt like fate itself was handing me the perfect opportunity instead of knocking on their door. Instead of pacing angrily around my porch, I picked up the phone and dialed the direct number the officer had given me. Within 20 minutes, a tow truck rolled down the street. Its bright yellow lights flashing like justice itself had arrived at my doorstep. The sound of the heavy chain clanking and the hydraulic lift lowering woke the sisters almost immediately. Their front door burst open, and both of them came stumbling out in pajamas and slippers, hair tangled, eyes wide with panic. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" the taller one screamed, her voice shrill enough to wake the neighbors. The tow truck driver didn't even flinch. "Ma'am, your vehicle is illegally blocking a private driveway. I have authorization from the city to remove it." The shorter sister stomped forward, waving her arms like a child throwing a tantrum. "You can't do this. This is our neighborhood. We've lived here longer than him. He doesn't own the whole street." I stepped onto my porch. Calm as ever, holding my phone in my hand. "Actually," I said evenly, "I do own this driveway, and I have months of evidence proving that you've been blocking it on purpose. The city has already reviewed everything. This is completely legal." The look on their faces was priceless, part shock, part fury, and part disbelief. They turned back to the tow driver, begging, yelling, threatening lawsuits, but the driver was immune to their theatrics. He attached the final chain, pressed a button, and slowly began lifting the front of the truck into the air. The sisters screamed louder, their voices cracking with desperation. "You can't tow it. We'll move it right now," they pleaded, but it was too late. Neighbors began to gather outside, drawn by the noise. I noticed Mrs. Carter watching from her porch, a satisfied smile on her face. Mr. Lopez stood a few houses down, arms crossed, nodding approvingly. For once, the entire street wasn't afraid of the sisters. They were amused. They were finally seeing justice served in broad daylight. The sisters, realizing they were losing, turned their rage on me. "You think this makes you the hero?" the taller one hissed. "Everyone's gonna hate you for this." The shorter one added, "You're pathetic. All this over a driveway." I met their glares without flinching. "This isn't about a driveway," I said firmly. "It's about respect, something you've refused to show anyone in this neighborhood." The tow truck driver climbed back into his cab and started the engine. The truck, now fully secured, began rolling away down the street. The sisters chased after it for a few steps, yelling curses that grew fainter as the vehicle disappeared around the corner. Then they stopped, panting, red-faced, utterly defeated. The silence that followed was almost sweet. The sisters stood frozen in the middle of the street, their eyes darting between me and the cluster of neighbors, watching with thinly veiled amusement. For once, they had no smug remarks, no sarcastic laughter. They simply turned and stormed back into their house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I stood there for a moment longer, breathing in the crisp morning air. For the first time in months, my driveway was clear. My car sat peacefully, free from the shadow of their arrogance. And more importantly, the power dynamic had shifted. They weren't untouchable anymore. They had finally been shown consequences. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The image of their shocked faces replayed in my head like a victory I'd earned through patience and persistence. But what I didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. Their humiliation at the tow truck was just the first crack in their armor. The real punishment, the one that would leave them broken, was still on its way. The morning their truck was towed had been satisfying beyond words, but the real storm came the following days. The Karen sisters were not the kind of people to quietly accept consequences. If anything, losing their truck ignited a new level of fury in them. By that afternoon they were at my door, pounding so hard it rattled the frame. I opened it just a crack, keeping the screen locked between us. "You think you're clever?" the taller sister snarled, her face flushed with rage. "That truck is worth more than your entire house." I kept my tone calm, almost casual. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before parking it across my driveway for months." The shorter one jabbed her finger at me through the screen. "You're going to pay for this. We're calling a lawyer. You'll be sorry." "Do what you need to do," I replied evenly, and closed the door. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from adrenaline. I had expected this kind of outburst, but I knew something they didn't. The law wasn't on their side. Later, I learned from a neighbor who worked downtown that the sisters had stormed into the impound lot that same day, screaming at the clerks behind the desk. They demanded their truck back, waving their arms and throwing insults at anyone who dared to tell them the truth. The truth was simple. Their vehicle had been towed legally, and it wouldn't be released until they paid the hefty fees that had already started piling up. But arrogance is a stubborn disease. Instead of swallowing their pride and paying what they owed, the sisters argued. They insisted the tow was unfair, that I had set them up, that the city had no right to touch their property. Their shouting matches became legendary in that small office. Employees later joked that they had never seen two people work so hard to make their own situation worse. Meanwhile, I was finally enjoying peace. For the first time in months, I could back out of my driveway without glancing nervously around for that red truck. Each morning was calm, quiet. My neighbors waved at me with approving smiles. Some even stopped by to thank me for standing up to the sisters. "We've all wanted to do something," Mr. Lopez admitted, "but you were the only one with the patience to really nail them." Their words reassured me that I had done the right thing, not just for myself, but for the whole street. But the sisters were far from done. A few days later, they left angry notes on my mailbox. The handwriting was messy, scrawled in capital letters, "You haven't seen the last of us and hope you like lawyers." I photographed each note, added it to my growing file of evidence, and then tossed the paper into the trash. If they thought intimidation would scare me, they hadn't been paying attention. As the days turned into a week, their desperation grew. I heard from another neighbor that they had tried calling the police themselves, claiming I had harassed them by stealing their truck. The officer they spoke to apparently shook his head and reminded them that their vehicle had been removed under city authorization. Their faces must have burned red with humiliation at hearing that their cries fell flat. The impound lot held their truck like a lion holds its prey. And each day they delayed paying, the storage fees grew. From what I understood, those fees added up fast, far more than the sisters were willing or perhaps able to pay. But instead of facing reality, they doubled down. They cursed at the clerks, filed meaningless complaints, and even tried to rally a petition in the neighborhood, asking people to side with them. Of course, nobody signed. After months of watching their selfish behavior, no one felt sympathy. I would sometimes glance at their driveway as I drove by. The empty space where their truck used to sit looked almost symbolic, like a throne stripped from tyrants who had abused their power too long. They now had to walk or hitch rides, and their once smug expressions were replaced with tight, bitter scowls. They avoided eye contact with neighbors, but their anger still simmered beneath the surface. One afternoon, I saw them carrying grocery bags up their front steps, panting and grumbling. Their pride wouldn't let them admit it, but life without their truck was hitting them hard. Their arrogance had trapped them in a cycle, too stubborn to pay the fees, too broke to hire a lawyer, and too entitled to admit defeat. That's when the letters started arriving, official ones this time, not the angry notes they had shoved in my mailbox. From what Mrs. Carter overheard, the city had warned them that if they failed to pay the impound fees, their truck would be auctioned off. It was standard procedure. Vehicles abandoned at the lot after a certain number of days were sold to recover the costs. The sisters, of course, laughed it off. "They won't sell our truck," one of them boasted loudly on her porch. "They're bluffing. We'll get it back eventually." They wouldn't dare. But her voice lacked the confidence it once had. Her laugh sounded hollow. Even from my yard I could see the worry in her eyes. Another week passed, and their anger seemed to transform into nervous energy. They made frantic phone calls on their porch, arguing with someone on the other end. I heard snippets of their conversations, complaints about the unfair system, mutterings about how expensive everything was. Their pride was slowly cracking, but still they refused to bend. Then, one crisp morning, I stepped outside to collect my mail and saw them standing by their mailbox, clutching a letter with pale, trembling hands. Their faces were drained of color, their mouths tight with shock. They didn't notice me watching, but I could tell from their stiff posture what the letter contained. The truck was scheduled for auction. Their time was up. For a moment I almost felt a twinge of pity. That truck had been their pride, their identity, their weapon against the neighborhood. Losing it meant losing the image they had worked so hard to project. But then I remembered the countless mornings I'd been trapped in my own home, the humiliating smirks, the mocking laughter. Any pity I felt dissolved quickly. This was justice. The neighborhood buzzed with quiet anticipation. Everyone knew the sisters' downfall was reaching its climax. The same women who had once strutted around with arrogance were now reduced to whispers, pacing nervously on their porch, faces pale as they clutched overdue notices from the city. Their empire of entitlement had crumbled, and the final blow was only days away, and when it came, it would be worse than they could ever imagine. The day of the auction arrived quietly, almost like any other morning. The sun was bright, the air was clear, and the neighborhood looked calm. But for the Karen sisters, it was the end of a long battle they had fought and lost. I had heard from Mrs. Carter that the city's notice had been final. If they didn't pay their mounting impound fees, their beloved red pickup would be sold to the highest bidder. They had ignored the warnings, laughed off the letters, and mocked the system. And now, there was no more time left to stall. That morning, I spotted them pacing outside their porch. Their faces were drawn and pale, their usual confidence completely gone. For months they had strutted around the street as if they owned it, mocking anyone who dared to challenge them. Now they looked like two cornered animals, tense and restless, eyes darting from house to house as if the entire neighborhood was watching their humiliation, which of course, we would. The sisters' arrogance had been the loudest sound on the block, and now their silence was just as loud. The auction itself took place downtown at the impound lot. I didn't attend in person, though part of me was tempted. Instead, I imagined the scene based on what I later heard. Rows of cars lined up like fallen soldiers, each waiting for someone to claim them. The sisters' truck, once polished and flaunted like a crown jewel, now sat dusty and worn, its tires sagging slightly from weeks of neglect. A sticker marked it as available for auction. To the city, it was just another vehicle. To the sisters, it was everything. When the bidding began, there wasn't much interest. The truck, despite its size and noise, was old, poorly maintained, and not worth nearly as much as the sisters boasted. The crowd of buyers knew what they were looking at, and they weren't about to overpay. The bids crept up slowly, $40, $60, then finally $87, and that was it. The hammer fell. and their pride, their so-called treasure, was gone for less than the price of a pair of sneakers. Back in the neighborhood, the news spread quickly. Mr. Lopez told me with a grin when I ran into him later that day. $87, he chuckled. Can you believe it? After all their bragging, all their arrogance, that truck wasn't even worth $100 at auction. The whole street buzzed with the irony of it. The sisters, who had used that truck as a weapon to control and humiliate others, had lost it for pocket change. That evening, I sat on my porch and waited. Sure enough, the sisters eventually returned, their footsteps heavy, their faces twisted with anger and shame. They didn't say a word to me, didn't yell or threaten like before. They just walked past with their heads down, avoiding everyone's eyes. Their silence was louder than any insult they had ever thrown. For the first time, the Karen sisters had been defeated, and they knew it. Life on the street slowly returned to normal after that. My mornings were peaceful again, my driveway clear and quiet. I no longer woke up with dread, wondering if I would be trapped inside my own home. My car sat where it belonged, untouched, free. The neighborhood felt lighter too. People waved more often, smiled more easily. It was as if the entire block had taken a deep breath now that the sisters' tyranny was over. Occasionally, I would see them walking down the street, grocery bags in hand or waiting awkwardly for rides from friends. They no longer boasted about their truck, no longer sneered from their porch. They were just ordinary, and maybe that was the worst punishment of all for two women who had lived on pride and superiority. Being reduced to ordinary was more painful than losing their vehicle. One night, as I closed my curtains, I caught a glimpse of the sisters standing on their porch. They were quiet, their shoulders slumped. For a brief moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered the countless mornings I had been trapped, the mocking laughter, the cruel remarks. I remembered the humiliation they tried to force on me, and the pity vanished. They had dug this grave themselves. All I had done was let them fall into it. In the end, the lesson was clear. Entitlement may make someone feel powerful for a while, but arrogance always crumbles when it collides with accountability. The sisters believed they were untouchable, that rules didn't apply to them. They thought mocking and bullying others made them stronger. But the truth is, respect isn't optional. It's earned, and when you refuse to give it, sooner or later, you pay the price. For me, it wasn't just about a driveway. It was about dignity, fairness, and standing up to people who believed they could trample over others without consequences. Watching that truck disappear for $87 wasn't just justice, it was closure. A final, poetic ending to months of frustration. Now, every time I back my car out of my driveway, I do it with a smile. Not just because I have my space back, but because I know the sisters learned a lesson they'll never forget. And if they didn't, well, protestables will always remember. The story of the Karen sisters and their $87 downfall became a neighborhood legend, a cautionary tale whispered over fences and shared with new residents. It was proof that arrogance might be loud, but justice, when it comes, is even louder.